It's a big deal.
I said this morning that elites care more about this than quote-unquote regular people. I think that's true. You know, elites control the coverage and elites control the political dialogue.
Yes.
Unfortunately, that's the case. So lots of Americans will care about this. But the people who really care about it, the people who will drive the coverage and chatter about it for days on end.
There's no doubt about that. But I know what you're saying is that they care more about it, but there are lots of normal Americans,
of course,
to reinforce the point. Lots of normal Americans were upset about this last night when he said it.
By it. All right, Democrats have no intention of letting this issue go. Last night, after the debate, Hillary Clinton paid her press corps a visit on the airplane and deemed Donald Trump's remarks horrifying. Today, some of Clinton's top surrogates twisted the knife a little more on the TV airways and out on the campaign trail.
If you question, if you assert that a democratic election is fixed, you are attacking the very essence of the notion whether we have a democratic system.
After a campaign where he has insulted everybody else and now he's going to insult the very central premise of our democracy was a huge shocker.
When you try to sow the seeds of doubt in people's minds about the legitimacy of our elections, that undermines our democracy. Then you're doing the work of our adversaries for them, because our democracy depends on people knowing that their vote matters.
There are plenty of Republicans who also are critical of what Trump said last night, including Senator John McCain, who once faced a decision about whether to challenge the results of a presidential election when he was on the losing side. So, John, before the debate last night, we agreed that Trump's chances were somewhere between slim and none. Does the prospect of a Hail Mary comeback now after what he said last night become even more remote?
Let's put it this way. Last night his chances of a comeback were between slim and none, and now Slim is packing his bags. This is, you know, again, there are many days, there are still 2.5 weeks before Election Day, and I don't rule out the possibility of some cataclysmic thing happening. In the absence of that, I think this thing is cooked, and there's not a way. Again, this was his last best chance last night, and he's now spent one full day, and we've just said he's going to spend more days now, again, justifiably answering criticism for this crazy thing he said last night and today.
It's answering criticism. It's keeping him from having anything positive going on in at least 2 news cycles, and it's keeping him from arguing that he actually won the debate, because he lost the debate on one single remark. I think he probably would have been judged of having lost it narrowly anyway, or somewhat. But the reality is that the polling data now has gotten worse, and I think it will get worse in the wake of this debate, because he'll have 2 days of bad coverage. He's got less time now. He's got no other big events.
Right.
And the other thing is, the perception is now amongst a lot of Republicans more than ever is it's done.
To win the election, he needed to gain some new votes. The thing he said last night did not gain him a single vote, and almost certainly lost him some votes, because there are some of the people he needed to attract who looked at that and said, I don't want that as my president. And now the split in the Republican Party is even wider, because you have down ballot Republicans who are going to say, you're calling into question if I win, my electoral system is now maybe rigged. I don't want any part of that.
And when Donald Trump and his inner circle are angry at the press, angry at the Republicans who criticize him, they don't perform well. He doesn't perform well. And they're angry now. They're like, this is a 90-minute debate. Why is everyone seizing on one thing? Because you said one thing that was completely out of bounds.
And just point to those 3 Democrats we just saw. We often talk about why Hillary Clinton has an advantage, because she has these big super surrogates who have big megaphones. They now, today, they think they have the boot on Donald Trump's throat, and they are pressing down
They thought the election was over before the debate. They're trying to end it de facto right now.
Exactly right. Okay, so how is the conservative media reacting to all of this? Their reaction has been mixed. On the one hand, Rush Limbaugh and Wall Street Journal editor-in-chief Gerard Baker defended Trump today, saying the mainstream press is overreacting to his comment. Others, like Byron York of the Washington Examiner, wrote in his column that Trump was, quote, headed toward his best debate of the campaign until those few seconds. Radio host Laura Ingraham, who's been a steadfast defender of Trump, tweeted, quote, he should have said he would accept the results of the election. There is no other option unless we're in a recount again, end quote. And all day today, there were conservative voices on Fox News calling the whole thing at best a distraction. Here's how Karl Rove summed it up on Fox & Friends.
He could have easily said, of course, I believe in the peaceful transition of power, and I'll accept the results of the election as they're certified and validated.
But he thinks the whole system's rigged.
Well, right. But look, here's the deal. This wipes out all the good things that he said last night on trade and on immigration, on the Clinton Foundation, because this is the headline.
So over on the other side of the ideological chasm, progressive pundits and much of the mainstream media hailed Clinton's performance as nearly flawless. Give you one example is Vox's Ezra Klein, who wrote that His performance last night basically put the finishing touch on, quote, the most effective series of debate performances in modern political history. So, Mark, just for the sake of argument, let's pretend we live in an alternative parallel universe where Donald Trump didn't call into question the post-election peaceful transfer of power. What would the verdict today be in that circumstance on last night's debate?
I think people would have had three main takeaways. One was that Hillary Clinton is a masterful debater, masterful at preparing, and had found her voice last night with some emotion and poignancy as much as she ever has on the national stage. Two, that Trump, what might have been for Trump, that if Trump had performed that well in the first debate and improved into the second and third from that baseline, things might have been different. And the last thing is that that he doesn't prepare.
Right.
Even by the third debate, he clearly was nowhere near as prepared as she was. And when Chris Wallace asked about substance, he was dancing.
I will say in the first 30 minutes of the debate, when Trump seemed almost like he was on a tranquilizers, he was actually better than he's ever been in any of the three debates.
No question.
But in the back hour, the same thing happened to him as has happened to him in all three of the debates, which is she effectively not only prepared on policy, but she psychologically prepared a strategy of getting under his skin. And every time she would say something like last night, it was when she said he choked when he went to Mexico. Immediately his demeanor changed. He started getting personal with her. The thing at the end of the debate where he called her a nasty woman, the thing where he said, you're a puppet, just all, she brought out all of the things she wanted to do, which is to call into question his temperament. And by baiting him that way and him rising to the bait, again, I think he lost the debate last night, even without the worst, egregious, most offense.
If you want a parallel universe, no Access Hollywood tape, no accusations of women coming into these two debates, I think a big part of the story last night would have been Hillary Clinton's evasions. Skillful, you know. Give her credit if Chris Wallace tried to pin her down on a number of issues she didn't answer.
Well, once we're living in that parallel universe, I want to take away WikiLeaks, too, and create a totally parallel universe.
All right, up next, we're going to break down some of the other interesting and important moments from last night's debate after these words from our sponsors.
Do you make the same commitment that you will absolutely, sir, that you will absolutely accept the result of this election?
I will look at it at the time. I'm not looking at anything now. I'll look at it at the time.
One of the prides of this country is the peaceful transition of power, and that no matter how hard fought a campaign is, that at the end of the campaign, that the loser concedes to the winner. Are you saying you're not prepared now to commit to that principle?
What I'm saying is that I will tell you at the time. I'll keep you in suspense.
That was the really big moment from last night's debate that everyone is still talking about and will for years. But there were other overshadowed very noteworthy exchanges throughout the evening that should get their due. So, for instance, there were times when Donald Trump displayed a rare calmness, composure, and policy-focused presence, as John suggested earlier, that offered a stark contrast to his more typical off-message remarks throughout the evening.
We need a Supreme Court that, in my opinion, is going to uphold the Second Amendment and all amendments, but the Second Amendment. The justices that I'm going to appoint will be pro-life. They will have a conservative bent. They will be protecting the Second Amendment. They are great scholars in all cases, and they're people of tremendous respect. They will interpret the Constitution the way the founders wanted it interpreted. It's all about the Constitution. The D.C. versus Heller decision was very strongly, and she was extremely angry about it. I watched. I mean, she was very, very angry when upheld. And Justice Scalia was so involved, and it was a well-crafted decision.
I'm not saying that if he had done that for 270 minutes over the 3 debates, he would have won, but it would have been a much different set of contests, I think.
It would have been. I mean, you look, I mean, if he tried to do that, the question would have been, I mean, I was impressed. I was surprised that he cited a case, that he cited Heller. He evinced no depth of, like, actually understanding. If you asked him to explain what does Heller say, I'm not sure he would know. But just tonally, that would have been a very different world that we lived in.
Well, it's hilarious. It's the exact tone that many of us said going into the first debate. Surely he'll adopt.
Yes, and that the Clinton campaign expected him to try to adopt, and then they spent a fair amount of time trying to force him to induce him to not adopt. So let's actually look at an example of that right now. Hillary Clinton, as the New York Times pointed out in a story today, was a little out of character last night as she tried some almost Trumpian maneuvers on the debate stage, interrupting, mocking, and needling her opponent repeatedly.
We had a meeting with the Mexican president, didn't even raise it, he choked.
Putin, from everything I see, has no respect for this person.
Well, that's because he'd rather have a puppet as president. This is a person who has been very cavalier, even casual, about the use of nuclear weapons. 10 people who have had that awesome responsibility have come out and in an unprecedented way said they would not trust Donald Trump with the nuclear codes or to have his finger on the nuclear button. There's only one of us on this stage who's actually shipped jobs to Mexico, because that's Donald. So he goes around with crocodile tears about how terrible it is, but he has given jobs to Chinese steel workers. He was borrowing $14 million from his father to start his businesses. And I'd be happy to compare what we do with the Trump Foundation, which took money from other people and bought a 6-foot portrait of Donald. I mean, who does that?
In my apartment today, on a very beautiful hotel down the street, known as Trump.
Made with Chinese steel. He didn't get an Emmy for his TV program 3 years in a row, and he started tweeting that the Emmys were rigged. And you're whining before the game is even finished. It just shows you're not up to doing the job, just like we went after bin Laden while you were doing Celebrity Apprentice. He was criticizing President Reagan. Social Security, payroll contribution will go up, as will Donald's, assuming he can't figure out how to get out of it. But what we want to do is to replenish the Social Security Trust Fund.
And there it was, right there. The Barb Fest, there were a lot of those barbs. Some Trump responded to, some did not. But then last one you saw, I think in a kind of crystallized moment, like that's the kind of thing she did for 3 debates. But at that moment last night, it's like that is it in a nutshell.
I praised Hillary Clinton's debate prep team before. Many of the people who worked with Barack Obama, they clearly learned how to work with her, to feed her things that she would, in her gut, in her heart, feel criticism of Obama, of Trump, with pre-written lines that she was comfortable delivering in her own voice, with her own attitude. Very smart.
And with a sense of almost, at least last night, with a sense of almost joy. Yeah. She was enjoying herself doing that.
She prepared hard, and they gave her a lot of good options, and she picked the right ones, clearly. All right. Clinton also overtly sidestepped some tough questions from the moderator, Fox News' Chris Wallace, and she did it in a way that many people, her skeptics and foes, have noticed.
We've learned from the WikiLeaks that you said this, and I want to quote, "My dream is a hemispheric common market with open trade and open borders."
Well, if you went on to read the rest of the sentence, I was talking about energy, an electric grid, an energy system that crosses borders. I actually think the most important question of this evening, Chris, is finally, will Donald Trump admit and condemn that the Russians are doing this?
Why isn't what happened and what went on between you and the Clinton Foundation? Why isn't it what Mr. Trump calls pay to play?
Well, everything I did as Secretary of State was in furtherance of our country's interests and our values. The State Department has said that. I think that's been proven. But I am happy. In fact, I'm thrilled to talk about the Clinton Foundation because it is a world-renowned charity. The Clinton Foundation made it possible for 11 million people around the world with HIV/AIDS to afford treatment, and that's about half of all the people in the world who are getting treatment. In partnership with the American Health Association, we have made environments in schools healthier for kids, including healthier lunches.
Respectfully, this is an open discussion.
Well, it is an open discussion.
I understand, and the specific question went to pay for play. Do you want to talk about that?
But there is no evidence. But there is a lot of evidence about the very good work
and it's a criminal enterprise, and so many people know it.
So that was not her most evasive.
No.
But if she did not enter this debate on her role, I think people would have focused on, she's pretty evasive there, but she handled it much better than some of the other challenges she's had on these tougher topics.
Well, and think about the contrast with her and Trump. I mean, I agree she's evasive, but this is what we talk about when we talk about someone doing well in a debate. Pivoting is part of what you're supposed to do.
And not seeming defensive.
Quick answer, get out, don't seem defensive, and go on the attack again. Again, another way in which her preparation, I think, helped her and did not hurt her.
I can see why Republicans are frustrated.
Well, you can see it, but yeah. All right, up next, it's a Schlapp attack. We'll talk to the American Conservative Union's Matt Schlapp after this. And now it's time for us to have our weekly dose of fun with our favorite social media app, Schlappchat. With us now from Washington, D.C. is the American Conservative Union Chair, Matt Schlapp, who's also a big Donald Trump supporter, although we'll ask him whether he still is after last night. So, Matt, there's a big split in the Republican Party right now over what Donald Trump did last night, unprecedentedly saying he wasn't sure if he would uphold or accept the election results. Where do you stand with those conservatives who are hitting him hard today, or with those conservatives who are making excuses for him?
I don't know. Maybe somewhere in the middle. I wouldn't have answered the question that way, John. I think I would like to see these two get to a point. One of them is going to get elected in 19 days. And I'd like to see these two be able to do something simple like shake hands on the stage. I think it was ridiculous that the Clinton administration or the Clinton campaign negotiated that they didn't have to shake each other's hand. If you don't have even enough respect to look each other in the eye and shake each other's hand. We're in a pretty bad place. We know the country is as well. And I think each should also, on Election Day, I'm confident if Donald Trump does not win, that he will, recognize.
Matt, let me ask you more directly. What was wrong with his answer?
I think the only thing that was wrong with the answer is that it overshadowed what I thought was a really good debate performance.
But what was wrong with that particular answer? You said you wouldn't have done it that way. What was wrong with the way he answered? What were the negative implications or costs of his answering that way?
I think the negative. I think it's bad. I just think it looks more magnanimous to say, look, I want to beat my opponent's brains in, but if she wins, I'm going to support that. And I think so I think that makes him look like the better man. I can understand, with everything we've learned on WikiLeaks and the way the Clintons roll, that he's frustrated. And he made it. I thought the answer that made that the clearest is when he said, you shouldn't even be able to run because of all the legal problems that we're all reading about. And he brought up the example of the 4-star general. So, I mean, there's a certain degree of frustration for those of us who are not Clinton fans that she has seemed to find a way out of every one of these legal concerns she's gotten in when others in similar positions have not.
Matt, you agree that America is an exemplar of democracy for people around the world, right?
Absolutely.
Right. You don't have any lack of faith in our ability to conduct a free and fair election, right?
I think we got the best elections on the globe.
So don't you think that all the ways that Trump is talking about this, from the thing he said last night to even the way he tried to fix it today, suggests that he's skeptical of that he seems to have doubts about the integrity of American elections? Is that really a helpful thing for a major party nominee to be expressing explicitly or implicitly?
Well, I think what it comes down to is this, and if you look at most of the polls and the Real Clear Politics average, it doesn't look like this race is a 1 or 2 point race, but there are polls that show it is. And let's say this race is tight at the end. As you all know, subjectivity does come into play. And I spent a month in Florida during the recount, and there was a bunch of Al Gore Democrats who did the same, because we know oftentimes it comes down to a room where somebody has to make a decision as to whether a hanging Chad results in a vote for one person or the other person. If you were Norm Coleman or you were Dino Rossi when they ran and they were leading all election night and into the early morning the next day, and after several recounts and several lawsuits, all of a sudden they didn't win the race.
Matt,
so there is subjectivity to close races.
Matt, we got less than a minute. You probably are seeing a lot of the same private Republican polling data we are that shows Donald Trump's standing in some of the key battleground states not as strong as it was 2 weeks ago. Tell me the states he's going to win to put him over 270 that media elites currently don't think he's going to win.
I think the states that will tighten and that he has to win, I think he has to get that electoral vote in Maine. I think he has to win New Hampshire. I think he obviously, if Virginia doesn't look like it improves, then you have to get to either Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin. He's got to win Nevada and he's got to win Iowa. And I think several of those states I just walked through are states that will tighten up dramatically over the next 2 weeks. I think the demographics look good for him. And I think I agree with that Investor Business Daily poll that shows it about a 2-point race for Hillary. That was the closest poll the last time, as you guys know more than me. And I think this race is tighter than a lot of these polls indicate.
We got to go to hard break. That was Schlaptastic. We're always happy to have you come back again soon. We'll be right back with Union Chief Randi Weingarten after this quick break.
welcome back with us now the president of the American Federation of Teachers, a big Hillary Clinton supporter, Randi Weingarten. Thank you for joining us.
It's always great to be with you, even virtually.
How would you rate Hillary Clinton's chances of being elected the president in November?
Well, you know, I'm one of these people who it's not over until it's over. But, you know, I think she has a pretty good chance now. And, you know, I'm not, you know, you look at the different Upshot and Nate Silver, and you see all the chances. And how the arc has changed. But I think what's happening is her trajectory is going higher and higher with a greater and greater percentage of showing that she's going to win. And Donald Trump's trajectory is in the opposite direction. And so normally at this point, things actually start showing which way the electorate is going. And I think people are confident in her competence. And so you're seeing not just the people who would ordinarily support a Democrat, but you're seeing more and more people saying when they look at these two candidates, there's only one of them that actually has the judgment, the temperament, even if you disagree with some of their positions.
Randi, one of the things the Clinton campaign has made clear for a long time now was that the key to her winning this race would be to disqualify Donald Trump.
Yes.
And with his help, they have done a pretty good job of that, or at least making him pretty toxic. As we turn this corner into the home stretch, what does Hillary Clinton need to do now as she prepares, perhaps, to get ready to govern? Should she continue to just basically trash Trump, or should she start doing something else?
So I think we have a November 9th problem, and I'm a big believer that you lean towards people's aspirations, not people's fears. And I think what she tried to do last night when she had the time to talk and to really debate was she actually lifted up aspiration. She talked about what her plans are going forward, not how to, and she did more of that than spar with Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump on a debate stage is so reckless, it's hard to ignore a lot of the things that he says. But I think that he himself disqualified himself so much yesterday that her path right now is to connect to people's aspirations, like JFK did, like FDR did, like Reagan did, and to show, as she said in her closing, that regardless of whether you vote for her or not, her responsibility is to be the president for everyone and to lift everyone and to actually make those words stronger together means something to people.
Randi, think about your friends and your family. Of the people you're closest to, who's someone who supports Donald Trump, and what's your understanding of why they support Donald Trump?
So, you know, there are a couple of people I know who support Donald Trump, and their view is that Washington is broken, and you need somebody to shake this whole thing up. It's like the people who would say, I need to change that house, so I'm just going to burn it all down. It's a level of frustration that that suggests that no rational thinking would pierce it. It's a level of anger that is really connected to a frustration about what has happened in Washington, and I think that it gets rooted to the point that what's scary about this is that when you see Donald Trump basically not distinguishing between fact and fiction and living in his own reality of life or whatever it is, people basically, his supporters believe him.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but are you saying that the 40 million or so people who will vote for Donald Trump are all irrational?
No, I am not saying that. I'm saying that there is a sense of loss that and that is emotionally moving people to feeling like he is going to be the savior, and that's very scary. But it does come underlying it. I'm actually saying underlying it is this sense of loss of their lives. And so I'm very sympathetic to that. That's what the labor movement has fought for all our life. It's a sense that people felt like that their lives should be better going forward, and they're not.
Randy, there's a lot of people on the left in the Democratic Party, particularly Bernie Sanders supporters, who've been reading some of the things that have come out of the WikiLeaks emails that feel like all of their suspicions about Hillary Clinton have been borne out by those emails. That she's different in private than she is in public. That she's she's a phony, basically. Do you have any sympathy with that view, with the progressive wing of your party that's frustrated with what they've seen in the WikiLeaks emails in that way?
Well, you know, I think there's two things about the WikiLeaks emails, and I want to separate them. One is the Watergate-type interference in elections, this time done by a foreign government. So let's put that aside, but that is a problem in of itself. I think what you're seeing here is you know, people are embarrassed. But this is what ends up happening in elections. It's what ends up happening in organizations. There was a really heated debate between Bernie and Hillary, and you see a lot of, you know, heated language. I mean, even there was one from me where I called somebody sanctimonious, and you know, in retrospect, you wonder why you would do that. But you see that kind of you see that in campaigns. The real issue, I think, is what we did at the platform, which was after all of these leaks, you know, which postdate all of these leaks, and what we tried to do together, Hillary's people and Bernie's people, to create the most progressive platform the Dems have ever had. And the accountability is what I think she said at the convention, which is when she looked at the Bernie people and said, look, we did this platform together. We ran ultimately together in the last month or so, and let's actually implement this. Let's actually do this. And I think that all of us on the progressive camp or the progressive side are going to have to try and make sure that we get to rewrite the rules of the economy, which is what most of us are talking about, and what the big difference was between where Bernie initially was and where Hillary initially was.
Okay, Randi Weingarten, thank you very much. We're going to hold a bipartisan strategy session right here, right next. And if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can listen to this program on the radio every day, Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We'll be right back.
week in New Hampshire, I gave a speech. and let me just say that since then, my office has been flooded with thousands of letters and emails from folks all across the country, speaking out for the values of decency and respect that we all hold dear. Men of all backgrounds and walks of life agreeing that decent men do not demean women. And we shouldn't tolerate this behavior from any man, let alone a man who wants to be the president.
That was First Lady Michelle Obama criticizing Donald Trump at a rally for Hillary Clinton in Phoenix, Arizona, not that long ago. First Lady was one of several powerhouse Democratic surrogates out on the trail today, hammering Donald Trump. With us from the city of brotherly love, that would be Philadelphia, is Republican strategist Kim Alfano. And here in our New York studio of brotherly love is Democratic strategist Mike Feldman. Mike, I want to start with you just because one of the things that's been happening since last night when Donald Trump made his comment about not necessarily accepting the results of the election is that people in his camp and people out there in the country have been saying, what's so bad about that? Al Gore contested the election in 2000. Given that your closeness to Vice President Gore and the fact that you were part of that story, explain to us whether they have a point or not.
They have a point, but it's the wrong point. This has been pretty well litigated today, but look, 2000 was a disputed election. As you both know, Florida was under recount by law. I think nobody would doubt that it was good to go through every legal process they could to determine that the will of the voter was actually honored by the process. But again, when the highest court in the land weighed in and stopped the recount, Al Gore, and there were plenty of people encouraging Vice President Gore to pursue it further, he not only graciously conceded the election, but he told everybody, look, don't trash the court. And there's a fine line here between anarchy, essentially, and a disputed Supreme Court decision. And it was a good moment. And what concerned me about last night were people that were going out and using that example when, in fact, what Mr. Trump did last night was the very opposite of that kind of graciousness.
Kim, remind everybody briefly where you stand on your party's nominee. You voting for him?
I'll keep you in suspense.
Okay, very funny. So Kim,
I'll tell you at the time.
Let's say that this program ends and your phone rings and it's Steve Bannon and Kelly and Conway on speaker, and they say, Mr. Trump's decided that debate answer and the way he tried to address it today is not good. He wants something new to try to put this behind us. What would you tell him to do?
Stop trying to be so clever. I think he gets himself in trouble where he has the meat of what people who are supporting him and people who are disgruntled with Washington and the system want to hear, and then he takes it too far. I think that happened to him a couple of times in the debate last night. He's got good gut instincts about what's going on in the hearts and minds of people who are tired of politics as usual, but then he tries to be too clever and put on a show instead of just laying that out there, and I think that's just because that's who he is.
Kim, when you were watching that debate last night, one of the things we discussed earlier in the show was that moment when Hillary Clinton made a comment about him not paying taxes, and then he sort of, not really under his breath, but he sort of snapped at her and said, he called her a nasty woman. I've heard from women all day today who read into that not just a snappiness, but a kind of misogyny that upset them. Do you, as both as a woman and a Republican woman, when you heard that, did you groan? What was your reaction to that comment by Mr. Trump?
I'm actually a suburban Pennsylvania voter.
Yeah, right. There you go.
Woman. So, look, I think that, I don't like the guy. I really don't. I don't want to hang out with him. But I think that that people are getting their panties in a bunch a lot over a lot of stuff. He says things in an incendiary way. He shouldn't. But he treated her like any other guy on who might be on the stage with her. So if you're a woman in a business like I have been for a long time where there were no women, I would have taken that as a compliment, not that I would want anyone to talk to me that way. But I wouldn't have gotten so upset over that. And I think that, the bulk of everything that he's been talking about for the last several days, it does turn him into a really big jerk. But actions as well are important. And if you look back over history, there are some whose actions have been pretty gross, too.
So Hillary Clinton calls you after the show and says, Mike, everybody around me says things are going really well. I want you to come to the headquarters tomorrow, interview everybody on the staff you want to. Make sure we're doing everything we need to do. Who would you talk to? What would you ask them?
Well, I think they're doing a pretty good job. Yeah. I would say, and I think she did it last night, but it was overshadowed by these comments that Mr. Trump made. She's got to start, and Randy alluded to it earlier, she's got to start laying claim to the outcome of this election, which at this point, I think if the election were tomorrow, people would view as a total repudiation of her opponent and not necessarily a mandate for her. And I think you saw her starting to do that last night. You saw her starting to try to talk to independents, moderate Republicans, and others and try to lay out a vision. And nobody heard very much of it just because of the outcome of the debate. So that's one thing, because they need to start thinking about how they're going to govern in addition to how they're going to turn out their vote and win this election. Just one thing that Kim said I think is really important, and I agree with what you said on the substance. But the debates, and I've heard, and it's been said often, but it's true. Debates do matter, and preparation for debates matter. And I think what this debate showed, and what all three debates have shown in totality, is a lack of preparation and a lack of discipline, which is troubling in a potential president of the United States. It's not like Mr. Trump didn't know that there was going to be a question last night about his comments leading up to it about a rigged election. Every single member of his team, including his running mate, was giving him a trail of breadcrumbs for that answer, and yet he still dominated the news the day after and the debate by making a comment that was clearly viewed out of bounds by even people in his own party.
I'm going to ask you guys both the same question now, but Michelle Obama's down in Arizona. We just played that sound. They're trying to win Arizona. The polls in Texas are pretty close. Georgia, Priorities USA, is now spending money there. Missouri, there are a lot of places suddenly the Clinton campaign is playing. Right now, today, if you had to project, you think Hillary Clinton will win by what-ish?
Oh, I don't know. I mean,
but this starting to look like a landslide to you, or do you think it's going to be tight still?
No, it feels electorally like she's going to have a very good night. I mean, it depends, obviously, on turnout. Again, her campaign has methodically been identifying and communicating to their voters. They have a pretty good idea of who's going to show up. I would guess the Trump campaign and the GOP have less certainty around who's going to turn out. And I think that what you saw today is an example of what the Clinton campaign is going to do for the next 2 weeks, which is surrogates, principals, everybody out there trying to energize and let people know what's at stake in the election.
Kim, you're going to be, if I'm going to ask you to be a dispassionate analyst sitting there in Pennsylvania, are you starting to feel a landslide, or does this still feel like a tight election to you?
I am loath to predict anything in this election ever, because I was on your show about 6 months ago and got everything wrong. So first, I'll lead with that caveat. I think that we can't really predict a landslide, though. To start with, in any election, it is sort of rigged, not in the way that elections don't work, but it is rigged. The Electoral College kind of leans Democrat to begin with, but I don't think that this is a left-right split anymore. I think this is a top-bottom split, and how that plays out on Election Day is going to be new and different for all of us to look at.
All right. Kim, you think there's any chance Donald Trump can win Pennsylvania, where you're sitting right now?
I will, keep you in suspense.
Man, Kim's taking a pass on all the questions today. But we always love having her here. Kim Alfano, you're awesome. Mike Feldman, you're, adequate. Thank you both. We will talk ticket splitting in the Clinton campaign's Arizona ambitions a little bit more when we come right back.
As Donald Trump struggles in some of the key battleground states, Republican Senate candidates are increasingly on the hunt for what is now an endangered species in America, the voter called the ticket splitter. Those voters are the focus of the latest piece in our BAFA Bloomberg Politics 8-week series we call Battleground 2016. Here to talk to us about the latest installment, our colleague Steve Yassino. So, Steve, country's more polarized.
Yep.
People tend to vote now along party lines more than they did, a generation ago. Why do these down-ballot candidates think they can change that and get a lot of ticket splitting, run ahead of Donald Trump in some of these contested races?
It is less common now. There's about 11% in 2012. 11% of the electorate voted for one party for president, another party for down-ballot. This year's different, partially because of Donald Trump's unpopularity, partially because he has less of an operation, a ground game operation, than past presidential candidates do, and he's more reliant on party operations, party ground games. The problem is that they have different goals than Donald Trump does, especially in an election like this where he's so unpopular. I talked to a party chairman in Arizona who was for Trump, totally supported him, but said, we're working in the same direction, but we have different goals. My goal is to turn out all Republicans, and at this point in the race, not all Republicans are for Donald Trump.
So how are campaigns, just in terms of methodology, like or mechanics of it, how are they trying to find ticket splitters, and what are they doing about that?
So we tried to recreate this with me and my colleague Sasha Eisenberg, and we took data. We took two different sets of data. We took the data that shows a voter's likelihood to be a Republican or a Democrat, their partisanship, and then we also took data that so their likelihood to be a Trump supporter. And in cases where we had Republicans with voters who looked like they were going to be Republicans, that number was higher than voters who looked like they were going to be Trump supporters. And so we said, okay, well, the difference between those two numbers, those are the vulnerable targets that the Clinton campaign might want to target. And we mapped them around a couple of the key swing states, and we found that the top 3 states that had these were New Hampshire, not really a surprise, there's still an independent streak there, but also Arizona, and also Ohio. And we know in Ohio things are so close that any sort of movement could move the needle in that state.
Arizona, obviously a huge focus because you've got a lot of Republicans there. We've seen Hillary Clinton move up. A lot of Republicans there who would be McCain voters, but not necessarily be Trump voters.
Yeah, that's right.
So how important is it? In other words, does John McCain need to get a lot of Clinton voters if he's going to be reelected?
No, it's actually the opposite. It's that Clinton needs John McCain voters if she wants to have a shot at winning that state. The Clinton campaign has been clear that they're making a play there, and so Republicans in Arizona have gotten a very mixed message. Their 2 senators, John McCain, Jeff Flake, have been anti-Trump. The chairman of their party has been one of the most vocal Trump supporters in the last few days, and so. If you're a Republican in that state, it's not really clear what you're supposed to do on Election Day.
Well, the governor there is a big supporter of Trump, too.
That's
so
right.
Maricopa County, really key county. You guys looked at that. What'd you find?
Yeah, so what we found there is most of the voters in the state are from Maricopa County, about 60%.
Around Phoenix.
I'm sorry?
Around Phoenix.
Yeah, around Phoenix, and so it's key to any sort of turnout in the state. But we found that a huge percentage of these ticket splitters were there. And a lot of them we found were Mormon, which is one group. We also found a lot of them follow the same sort of trends that Trump has had problems with: women, high education voters, young people, things like that. So that's where they would go. Yeah.
Okay, Steve Yassino, thank you very much, and we'll be right back.
Mr. Television. So me and Will each have a new Culture Caucus podcast up with David Axelrod. We talk about a lot of things about politics, but also about the Cubs and the Dodgers. Now split 2-2, best of 7. Who you got?
Cubs. Cubs must win. Cubs must win.
He's a Cubs man. I got to say, I'm from LA, but I'm actually sort of rooting for the Cubs. We have more from our new Bloomberg Politics National Poll also on the website, BloombergPolitics.com. Coming up on Bloomberg Technology, Emily Chang has more from the Vanity Fair New Establishment Summit. Until tomorrow, from me and Mark, we say to you, we're glad we're out of Vegas, and we say, sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg Technology. Let's begin with a check of first word news. An Iraqi military commander says special forces have driven Islamic State out of a town east of Mosul. Meantime, officials say an American service member died Thursday from wounds received in a roadside bombing. It was the first American combat death since the Mosul operation began. More than 100 U.S. special forces are embedded with Iraqi units. The U.S. trained force is expected to lead the way into Mosul in the coming days. British Prime Minister Theresa May is telling European Union leaders there will be no turning back from Brexit. That's according to two senior British officials. They say there will be no second referendum on leaving the European Union. May's attending her first EU summit as Prime Minister. Fox News drew the largest audience, 11.3 million viewers, for Wednesday night's third and final presidential debate. Nielsen data shows almost 69 million people tuned in across 11 cable and broadcast networks. That's bigger than the TV audience for the candidate's second debate, but smaller than the first, which attracted a record 84 million viewers. Tonight, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump will attend the Al Smith dinner here in New York City. The candidates will trade one-liners in a custom going back 70 years. They'll sit just one seat apart, separated by New York's Cardinal Timothy Dolan, who will keep the comedic peace. I'm Mark Crumpton. Bloomberg Technology is next.
Chang, and this is Bloomberg Technology. We are coming to you live from the Vanity Fair New Establishment Summit in San Francisco, where we're hearing from some of the most influential voices in technology and innovation shaping our future. This hour, we will hear from some of Silicon Valley's most candid tech leaders. We'll hear from Social Capital's Chamath Palihapitiya, Udacity founder Sebastian Thrun, inventor of the self-driving car, and Alibaba co-president Mike Evans. Plus, we'll dig into Microsoft with shares soaring in after-hours trading after after the tech giant crushed it on earnings, and that is where we start. Microsoft shares popping over 6% in extended trading. The Windows company releasing better than expected results, buoyed by growing demand for cloud-based software and services. Revenue was over $22 billion, up 3% from the same quarter last year. The company had a net profit over $4.5 billion, up 2% year over year. CEO Satya Nadella has been investing in data centers and striking partnerships to bolster sales of Microsoft's main corporate cloud products like Azure and Office 365. Here to break down the numbers from our San Francisco studio, our editor-at-large, Corey Johnson. So, Corey, let's start with the turnaround plan at a high level. How is Satya Nadella's turnaround plan going?
Looks good. I mean, you know, we've seen a couple of quarters and increasingly improving results on the top line. Of course, the company continues to be a profit and free cash flow machine. But we see this sort of increasing level of revenue growth. The sort of second derivative of revenue growth is that the revenue is growing, and it's growing at a faster and faster rate, and that's exactly where they wanted to be, making these big changes while continuing to have some success with Windows and Office.
Let's talk about PCs. You know, obviously, you know, so many questions around the future of the PC market. Intel actually reported strong results around PCs. What about Microsoft?
So Microsoft's results in the PC business were not great, but maybe not as bad as some had feared. About a negative 1% change, that is to say, declining by about 1% in PCs. And that could have been a lot worse. Of course, that's in the Windows market. That could have been a lot worse, particularly the third quarter, which can be the calendar third quarter, which can be so bumpy for this company. So going into Q4, we'll look to see how that might diverge. You know, of course, Intel, when they guided, they said fourth quarter because there was early ordering in their third quarter, calendar quarter. The fourth quarter might look a little light. No indication of the same from Microsoft. So we'll see how that plays out. But you know, usually when as goes Intel, goes the rest of the PC industry, and as goes Microsoft.
Let's dig into the cloud, because this is Satya Nadella's big bet. A lot of people saying this could be the future of Microsoft. How is cloud revenue shaping up versus the giant in the room, AWS, Amazon?
So the cloud business was fantastic for Microsoft. They reported on a year-over-year basis, they reported a substantial increase in their cloud business writ large, but especially in their Azure business. That's the business most comparable to Amazon Web Services. Indeed, in constant currency, they saw gains of 121%. But if you look at it quarter after quarter, what you actually see is an acceleration of that growth rate off of last quarter, the 108% growth. So 121% growth is really fantastic, even as that business is getting a lot bigger. And on a year-over-year basis, that's a giant number, or at least a giant percentage. We don't know the actual numbers. When you look at Amazon's percentage change on a year-over-year basis, it's growing at a much slower rate. Now, it's a much, much bigger business. Some estimates are at least 5 times as large. But when you look at Amazon Web Services, year-over-year growth rates, they're nowhere near as strong and indeed declining. Now, they'll happily take 58% when they're looking at such a big business. Nonetheless, Microsoft's growing at nearly twice that rate.
All right, our Bloomberg editor-at-large breaking it down. Corey Johnson, thank you so much for that update. Turning now to ride-hailing, Didi Chuxing has its eyes set on targets beyond China. Didi Chuxing President Jean Liu told me about the company's global ambitions earlier today right here at the Vanity Fair New Establishment Summit. Take a listen.
We're definitely going global. Every market is very, very different, so either through local partnership or, you know, because we're a big sponsor and big believer in local players. We think there are a lot of local knowledge and, you know,